Hey there, Street Dogs. This is Yuan, and welcome to Street Drifters FM. Many people have been asking me, dude, how do you make your own podcast? Simple. Anchor. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast on your phone or from any computer. Also, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so that it can be heard through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. How cool is that? It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. See ya. Hey there, Street Dogs. This is Yuan. Welcome to episode 3 of Street Drifters FM. For this episode, we will be talking about different focusing techniques that you can use on your next outing. Let's go. First off, I think for most photographers, the easiest way is to rely on their camera's autofocus system. I mean, it's fast, it's efficient, it's reliable. And I think if you just point your camera with its autofocus system turned on a particular scene or subject and you just snap your way through it, you got the photo. Instantly, it's easy. And I think this focusing technique works well if you're a bit shy or if you're a beginner and you want to just click your way through busy streets or busy scenes or the scene that you're actually looking at or the scene that you're actually looking for. Or if you want to be, you want to have a casual shoot, you want to have a very relaxed experience when you are taking your time on a particular scene, then yeah, I think the autofocus will work well for you. I think the autofocus system is very, advantageous for street photographers, mainly because you don't need to think of the distance of your subject or the distance of the scene or the focusing range of your camera as it relates to that particular scene that you're actually photographing. I think with autofocus, there are two main problems with it. I think it's number one, the unreliabilityness of the autofocus system of your camera, and at the same time the speed of the autofocus system of your camera. Now, I know I said autofocus is reliable. It is part of the perks of having an autofocus system in your camera. I think the main problem lies on how long and how often will the autofocus be reliable. I mean, will the autofocus system of your camera nail focus 100% of the time? Maybe 90? 80, 70, 60, 50? We don't know. I mean, not all cameras utilize the same autofocus system, so it might pose as an issue. Another would be the speed of the autofocus. Like I said, not all cameras utilize the same autofocus system and therefore would have different focusing speed and different end results. Most likely, if you rely on autofocus, there will be times that you wish the camera could decide much better when it comes to focusing. Now, usually this happens if you, for example, chose the wide focusing area in your autofocus system in your camera. I think your camera will have difficulty focusing on which subject that you're actually looking at. Probably you wanted to focus on something that is near to you and the camera suddenly jumps to the further side of that particular scene. Now with autofocus system, you have two main options in your camera. That is single autofocus and continuous autofocus. Now with some cameras we have automatic AF. With Sony, with Fuji, I think yeah, single point autofocus and then continuous autofocus. With single autofocus, it is reliable in this if your subject is not particularly moving too fast. I mean, it's okay. With continuous, I think continuous autofocus is very advantageous for a street photographer, mainly because it could help them track their subject if they are moving from one point to the next point. It could be easier to recompose as opposed with a single autofocus system. So yeah, that's autofocus. And again, to repeat autofocus, if you're a bit shy and if you're a beginner and you want to be relaxed in that particular photo op, I think autofocus is the way to go. Now, to remedy the issue, if you're, for example, a control freak like I am, another focusing technique would be manually focusing on the particular subject or element or scene that you're photographing on. Now, it doesn't matter, I think, what you're photographing at, you always end up slowing down your process. And I think there's no problem with slowing down. With slowing down, you get to compose properly. When you're slowing down, you get to focus properly. You know, all those perks. And I think if you're a control freak, like I said, you want to control at what particular distance you want your camera to focus on. Or is there a particular region or a particular subject that you want your camera to focus on, you know? I think with manual focus, the only downside is if you're too impatient to get the shot. I think, yeah, sure, when you're doing manual focus, you really need to accept and consider the fact that you're going to miss a couple of shots. But if you're impatient, if you're that particular type of person, I think whenever you miss an opportunity or a moment, you'll be very hard on your camera, you'll be very hard on yourself, and it might be very difficult for you to accept that you missed that particular shot, and you know, those kinds of things. I think for beginners, manual focus can be a little troublesome. However, it is a good practice to improve one important aspect in your street photography journey, and that is patience. A patient person goes a long way. I mean, let's say for example, you see a scene and you like the scene, you want to photograph that scene. However, the decisive moment hasn't happened yet on that particular scene. So what do? We wait for that decisive moment to come to the scene so that you may be able to shoot. Now, let's say for example, you missed that decisive moment. Then you need to wait a little longer. You know, you need to work the scene. And when you're working the scene with manual focus, you need to really slow down your process of how you take photographs on the street. Now, I think the appeal for manually focusing on the subject is the fact that it becomes more personal in the sense that you are more intentional on your shooting experience. I mean, with manual focus, I think it will be very difficult if you're just looking at the LCD monitor of your camera. Judging that if you're using mirrorless or let's say a point and shoot, you'll be using the LCD monitor. However, I think it will be very difficult because you can't judge or discern properly if you're actually in focus. You know, to do that, we need a viewfinder to really fine-tune our focus to get that tack sharp image that we want to have. I think all of us should try manual focusing because number one, it makes you more patient. With my case, I started with autofocus, and then Yeah, I did like it. However, I wanted to control the focusing area that my camera focuses on. Now I'm using a Sony a6000. It's a very old camera, and at that time I was using the kit lens. You know, I I was a hobbyist, and I still am a hobbyist, and in my opinion, I don't need to buy more gear to satisfy my need to take photographs, candid photographs in the street. But with that particular system, the Sony a6000 with the 650 kit lens, it somehow, yeah, I liked it. It somehow didn't work for me, and so I end up buying a cheap manual focus lens. Actually, it is a Meiki 35 1.7, I believe. Yeah, 1.7. And then I started manual focusing while I was a beginner street photographer. And let me tell you, it was so hard. Every time I miss a shot, I blame myself. Sometimes I blame the camera for it, you know? However, as I was getting used to the whole manual focusing scenario or situation, I realized that I love manually focusing a particular scene. Sure, it slows me down. Sure, people would stare at me, you know, putting camera against my eye and then manual focusing. But yeah, it was fun. I think in my case, I didn't mind the attention. It's just that it was too darn slow. The process was cumbersome. It was not a good thing in all levels. However, what it made me do was work the scene. So sometimes, not all the time, sometimes I would stay on the scene, let's say 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and then just work the scene, wait for a particular element to enter the scene so that I may be able to photograph it. And since I'm used to manually focusing now, I can actually discern the distance of my focusing area. Let's say I wanted to focus on 1 meter or 2 meters or 4 meters or beyond, or closer, like 0.8 meters, you know. Somehow with manual focusing, it taught me how to measure distance by eye. Anyway, before we proceed with our topic, let's listen to a song from a post-rock, post-metal band from Davao City, Philippines. Now, while we're listening to this band, I want all of us to reflect on what type of focusing technique we use to shoot the street, and what focusing technique do we want to learn to use whenever we shoot the streets. Now, I actually featured this band on the previous podcast, episode 2, and since they actually like that, they wanted to be featured a second time. So for the second time, here is Bungot Republic with their song Now We Run. Enjoy. SDFM.
SDFM.
Again, that was Bungot Republic with their song Now We Run. They are available in Spotify and other online streaming platforms. Now, if you have a band or if you know someone who has one and they'd want to have one of their songs featured, kindly send them to me using the email in the description. Now, going back in relation to manual focusing, another technique that I think almost all the street photography masters were using whenever they go out and shoot the streets is zone focusing. Now, zone focusing, or sometimes known as scale focusing, is a focusing technique that makes use of the focal plane of a lens to shoot in a very fast-paced situation while maintaining focus. Now, this is done by pre-focusing to the desired range distance that the photographer wants. For instance, if a photographer usually shoot the street and maintain focus at around, say, 4 meters, then the pre-focus distance should be at 4 meters. And so before the photographer shoots the street, he or she would pre-focus or preset his lens to 4 meters and just leave it there for the duration of the shoot. Now, we can't actually talk about zone focusing without talking about hyperfocal focusing. Now, these two are very different techniques. You can either use only one of them or both of them at the same time. Now, hyperfocal focusing is using the distance in the front and beyond of a particular scene. Now, we usually use the aperture to lessen the depth of field of the scene, making everything in focus more or less, or making everything acceptably in focus more or less. Now, for pros, I think they already know this technique, or these techniques rather. But for those who don't, for the beginners out there, like I said, you can actually use only one of them. Either one of them is okay. But for shooting streets, I think using both of them is actually very beneficial. Here's how it works. Now, since let's say you're focusing or you're pre-focusing to 4 meters, we should also predetermine the aperture or the f-stop. Let's say you pre-focus on 4 meters and then preset your aperture to f8, and using your 35 millimeter on your camera. Your 35 millimeter lens on your camera. Now, with this, it gives you a focus area from 2 meters to infinity. Now, obviously, the sharpest area would be around 4 meters. However, your hyperfocal distance focusing technique will give you a sort of breathing room between 2 meters to infinity, so that you'll have enough room to work with your composition. Now, vintage lenses and some newer manual focus only lenses have markings on the lens body that shows the hyperfocal distance. So let's say, for example, if your aperture is f8, so this is your near focus and this is your far focus, and the middle is the one that is tack sharp in focus. Now, using zone focusing and hyperfocal focusing technique mainly works well with 25 to 50 millimeter lens. Anything more than 50 millimeter is actually going to be very difficult due to the fact that the lens is tighter as it goes telephoto. I think, in my opinion, this is actually faster. Using zone focusing and hyperfocal focusing, this is actually faster in the street mainly because you won't be bothered with focusing anymore. You won't be fiddling with the focus ring. You won't be worrying about the autofocus system of your camera focusing on a different subject or element. I think the only thing you'll need to worry about if you're using zone focusing and hyperfocal focusing is your composition. Does your composition work well? Is the photo strong enough? Personally, I use zone focusing and hyperfocal focusing in my street photographs. I usually set my Sony a6000 to aperture priority mode. Sometimes I shoot in manual, but to make things easier for me and to make me only worry with composition only, I just stay with aperture priority. Now the lens that I'm using, like I said, is a cheap manual focus only lens. It is a Meiki 35 f1.7. It gives me around a 50mm equivalent, and it works great. I have no problem so far, and it actually this also fixes one of the problems with manual focusing. If you're very impatient, it actually helps you take photos a bit faster. However, be very careful though, as you are only pre-focused to 2 meters to infinity. Anything, maybe if your subject is maybe not in the 4-meter range, he or she is, or it is actually in the 3-meter range, then you actually miss your focus there. However, it is still acceptably sharp, mainly because it is covered from 2 meters to infinity. Focusing techniques, I think it is very subjective. I mean, different photographers, different techniques. No one is actually superior to the other, and we are actually all entitled to our own creative expression. Personally, I use manual focus, specifically zone focusing and hyperfocal focusing techniques. This is because I sometimes shoot analog film whenever I go out, and I have this old half-frame film camera, a Fujica drive, and the light meter is basically broken, and since it's a rangefinder, you need to measure the distance. So somehow it taught me how to measure the distance whenever I shoot the street with manual focus. Now, to me, I think whatever works for you is the best technique for you. Now, there's no there's no error, or there's no fault in experimenting. Let's say you wanted to focus at only infinity. You don't mind about some of the elements in the frame in the photograph not being too tack sharp. It's fine. You're entitled to that. And once you get the hang of it and you somehow develop your own style of focusing, and then I think it's a worthy experiment. Anyway, that's it for episode 3 of Street Drifters FM. Tune in next episode as we talk about the various shooting modes that one can use in street photography. Now, I try to post 1 episode per week, so subscribe to the cast to get notified when a new episode is available. Also, when you go out in the streets, stay safe and stay healthy. Take your vitamins, sanitize, and wear a mask. Let's all be responsible and help stop the spread of this disease. Now, I'll be posting my email in the description so that you can send me a song if you have a band, or if you know someone who has a band, they can send their songs or their song to that email so that I may be able to feature them in the next episode. Also, You can also use that email if you have any suggestions or feedback to make the cast more interesting. Or if you have any questions about the cast or questions about photography in general, you can send them over to my email address, which is available in the description. Anyway, that is it. I've said a lot. Catch you next time. Stay safe, Street Dogs. Peace.
SD